over now to Mark. Mark is also part of the Born Free Foundation, but Mark is actually a veterinary, so he knows what he's talking about. You've heard Dominic talk about veterinaries making comments about the culls working and it's not working, goodness knows what else. Mark is a long-term veterinary, has lots of experience, and he's going to talk about the veterinary aspects, I believe.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Follow Dominic Dyer, there's a challenge. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Jones. I'm a vet. I work for as Adrian said, I work for the Born Free Foundation. It's fantastic to see so many of you here today. Thank you for coming and showing your support for badgers, as always. I'd also like to thank the organisers and my fellow speakers. Dominic, obviously, who many of you know, Adrian, and Pauline Kidner, who you'll hear from shortly, and who do so much to protect badgers and other wildlife here in Somerset and beyond. I've been involved in a small way with the patrols in Gloucestershire over the past couple of years, and it's always, to me, it's always inspirational to see people from all walks of life dedicating their time, often working during the day, coming out at night and putting so much effort into trying to protect our precious wildlife. When I qualified as a vet way back when, back in the mid-80s, after several years of hard studying, I was really proud to enter the veterinary profession. And I have to say, I'm very sorry to say, that pride has been seriously dented by some of the things that some individuals and organisations claiming to represent vets have been saying about badgers in recent times. So I'd like to talk briefly about the veterinary profession's position on badger culling. I'd also like to talk about the inspiration I draw from the increasing number of vets and vet nurses who are finding their voice and speaking out in support of wildlife. Now, it's important to remember from the start, I think, that the veterinary profession and its members have a really important part to play in all this. Vets working in farm practices have very, very close working relationship with their farm clients, and they're in a strong position to influence farmers' thinking and their actions. Indeed, many of them rely on TB testing of cattle for a significant proportion of their income. And the organisations that represent the veterinary profession, and in particular the British Veterinary Association, are also in a position to influence industry and government. And of course the government itself employs vets to advise on animal health and animal welfare policy, the most important of who is the Chief Veterinary Officer at DEFRA. All these vets and veterinary bodies have an important role, and because of this they have a very big responsibility to act professionally, drawing on the best evidence and advice, and above all act in the best interests of all the animals concerned and affected by their advice and their decisions. Sadly, I've long been of the opinion that badgers affected by badger culling have been badly let down by some vets and some of our professional bodies. Let's start with the British Veterinary Association, whose membership includes probably about half the vets in the UK. The BVA has supported badger culling from the outset, and it's important to remember that it still does. In its most recent announcement on the issue in April this year, the BVA called for badger culling to be rolled out using cage trapping and shooting to other areas where it says badgers contribute to the high incidence of TB in cattle. So the BVA has been and remains a supporter of badger culling, and this support is strongly influenced by some of its member organisations, particularly the British Cattle Veterinary Association. So how does the BVA justify this position? Well, Dominic's mentioned it today. Remember the randomised badger culling trial? Remember that big 10-year trial that cost 50 million quid? 11,000 badgers were killed? Well, the BVA claims that the results from the randomised badger culling trial support the case for culling badgers to reduce TB in cattle. All I can say is they must have been reading a very different version of the recommendations that came out of that massive trial. In the version I read, and I'm going to quote here, the randomised badger culling trial concluded that badger culling can make no meaningful contribution to the future control of TB in cattle in Britain. It also said, and this is particularly important for the veterinary profession, I think, it's unfortunate that agricultural and veterinary leaders continue to believe, in spite of overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary, that the main approach to cattle TB control must involve some form of badger population control. And remember that since then, Natural England's former scientific advisor branded the recent badger culls an epic failure, and the government's own independent expert panel found that the pilot culls in Gloucestershire and Somerset were both ineffective and inhumane. Of course, history and recent experience tells us that bovine TB in cattle can be controlled without resorting to slaughtering wildlife. The last time bovine TB was a massive problem for the cattle industry was back in the late 1950s, and cattle-based measures were introduced then which reduced the number of cattle slaughtered across the country from about 25,000 in 1959 to just 2,000 10 years later. You can do the maths, but that's a massive reduction. And all that happened before we even knew that badgers could be infected with bovine TB. And in the past 5 years, Dominic's mentioned this, stricter cattle-based measures in Wales have reduced the number of cattle slaughtered because of TB by almost a half without a single badger being shot. And similar measures are starting to have a big impact across many parts of southwest England. So how the BVA can claim that the evidence supports badger culling is frankly completely beyond me. However, following a lot of pressure, the BVA has recently rejected the use of so-called controlled shooting, what most of us would call free shooting, on the grounds that it hasn't been shown to be humane. Its current president said in April that it's difficult to argue that the use of controlled shooting for badger culling is ethical when another more humane and effective method is available. Now, by more humane and effective method, they mean trapping and shooting. Well, I would argue, I would agree with the BVA that there is a more humane and effective method available, but it's not trapping and shooting, it's trapping and vaccination. And that's what the vets ought to be supporting. How the BVA can support killing badgers, the vast majority of which are perfectly healthy, when a vaccine is available, is, to say the least, quite incredible. Nevertheless, the BVA's rejection of free shooting does finally signal its recognition that badger welfare is affected by culling, and that this is something the veterinary profession ought to be concerned about. Surely we should have known that anyway. That at least, I suppose, signals some progress. Sadly, the BVA's concerns have been pretty quickly dismissed by government ministers who have said that free shooting is going to continue anyway. Which brings me to the Chief Veterinary Officer at DEFRA. Like the BVA, DEFRA's chief vet has been a supporter of badger culling since the outset, and he's had a big role to play in its development and its implementation. When the cull companies in Gloucestershire and Somerset failed to kill their target numbers in that allocated 6 weeks back in 2013, as was required by their licences, the decision to extend those culling periods was based heavily on the chief vet's advice. And when the second year of culling failed to address the independent expert panel's concerns about humaneness, the chief vet decided that rather than accept the independent expert panel's advice, he would more or less dismiss their concerns and instead make his own decision based on the premise that killing badgers by free shooting is similar to shooting other animals like deer, which is perfectly acceptable to society. He's failed to withdraw or amend that advice since the BVA has had its change of heart on free shooting. Now, I absolutely disagree with the chief vet's support for badger culling, but to my mind the chief vet should at least have called a halt to the culls when it became obvious that free shooting was causing badgers to suffer and that the companies would never be able to satisfy their licence requirement. By effectively dismissing the welfare concerns of other eminent vets and experts, he has, in my mind, crossed a very dangerous line. The chief vet, above all others in the veterinary profession, is in a unique position to call the government to account. And in my view, he failed to act when he should have done to prevent unnecessary animal suffering. There have been other loud voices among vets in favour of killing badgers. One prominent cattle vet from Gloucestershire has been quoted as saying that the killing of small black and white animals has actually saved the lives of huge numbers of large black and white animals. But these claims are simply not supported by the evidence. I mean, there have certainly been reductions in TB across Gloucestershire and Somerset in the past couple of years, but as we've already indicated, they reflect similar reductions in Wales and much of the southwest region of England. And thanks to ongoing improvements in cattle testing, movement restrictions and biosecurity measures, those reductions are ongoing. Even the chief vet himself, who I've just been talking about, has said it's far too early to expect to see any benefits from the culls that have taken place over the last 2 years in Gloucestershire and Somerset. Vets need to deal in good evidence, not anecdotal mumbo-jumbo. Let's be clear, there is no evidence to support the claims that the badger culls in Gloucestershire and Somerset have made any difference to cattle TB in those counties. Another cattle vet in Gloucestershire has apparently become something of a Facebook sensation recently. I don't know much about Facebook, but if you follow it, you may have seen it, by posting an emotional story about the trauma that a farming client and his family are going through following a positive TB test in their cattle. Now, I'm sure we agree that the impacts of TB breakdowns on individual farmers and their families are devastating. But telling this farmer that shooting a few badgers might sort his problems out isn't going to help him. Yet more of my colleagues have suggested that badgers should be gassed. They clearly have never read the reports of the appalling suffering endured by badgers in the gassing trials conducted at Taunton Down in the early 80s. And perhaps most worryingly of all, some vets have reportedly suggested they might turn a blind eye if their farming clients took the law into their own hands and targeted badgers on their own land by using such appalling techniques as lacing food with paracetamol and rolling it into sets. Now, for vets who are supposed above all to care about animal welfare, to even suggest this kind of thing is, to my mind, completely unacceptable. Blaming badgers for the mess the farming industry has got into with tuberculosis is nothing more than scapegoating. We've heard earlier this week how dairy farmers are struggling to make ends meet because of the poor prices they're getting for milk, and Dominic talked about this. Playing the badger blame game isn't going to help those struggling farmers. Convincing them that spending their hard-earned cash and the hard-earned cash of taxpayers on killing badgers will only make matters worse. And I believe it's disingenuous and unprofessional for members of my profession to be doing that. The message coming from government and from parts of the veterinary profession that badgers are to blame for TB in cattle and that going out and shooting them will somehow solve this problem is just plain wrong. The veterinary profession needs to learn that if we want to have public confidence in our claim that we're acting in the best interests of animals, we can't pick and choose which animals we care about and which we don't. As a profession, we need to consider the impacts of our advice and our actions on all animals involved, and that includes wild animals. So, having pretty much damned my own profession, I would like to finish by saying that I have been really inspired by the grassroots support among vets, vet nurses, for a more compassionate, precautionary and evidence-based approach to this problem and to wildlife interventions in general. Over the past couple of years, an increasing number of vets and vet nurses and other veterinary professionals have come together to challenge our professional bodies, government representatives and those within the profession who support the killing of badgers. This group isn't, as some would claim, a bunch of urban dog and cat vets who don't know anything about the countryside. On the contrary, it includes professors of epidemiology and animal welfare, small and large animal clinicians and nurses, people with expertise in cattle and wildlife disease, conservation science, wildlife medicine and pathology, neuropathology, molecular biology, veterinary ethics, I could go on. And as it continues to grow, I believe our voice is becoming increasingly difficult for our professional bodies and representatives to ignore, and we won't stop. Back in 2012, the World Organization for Animal Health were quoted as saying, veterinarians should be the leading advocates for the welfare of all animals and should provide leadership to society on ethical considerations involved in the use and care of animals by humans. Now, me and my colleagues are doing all we can to ensure that our profession will make a better job of fulfilling this in future than it's doing at the moment when it comes to wildlife in general and badgers in particular. Thank you very much.